A fisherman hauled up a barnacle-crusted camera in his net, but when he switched it on, he realized this wasn't just lost equipment, it was evidence of something the ocean had hidden. And as he stared into the lens, it felt as though something in the deep was staring back at him. Subscribe to the channel and write where you're watching this video from. James Holloway, 62, retired fisherman and former Marine, thought his life would remain quiet. But on that morning, the sea gave him something it should never have returned. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The morning was like any other along the worn docks of Cedar Point, a fishing town that had lived and died with the tides for over 100 years. James Holloway's boots struck the planks with the slow, heavy rhythm of habit, each step echoing in the fog that clung low across the harbor. The gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp against the thick silence of dawn. Salt and diesel hung in the air, mingling with the faint metallic scent of wet iron from rusted boat rails. James, 62 years old and bent slightly from decades at sea, moved with a precision that came from ritual. Every morning was the same. Untangle the nets. Check the lines. Start the engine, which coughed like an old smoker, before it finally settled into a growling hum. He had done this routine since he was a boy, when his father had first pressed a rough hand against his shoulder and said, "The sea doesn't forgive, son. Learn her ways, or you won't come back." He had learned. He had come back, though he sometimes wondered, at what cost? Out on the water, the horizon blurred into the fog, sea and sky melting together in a seamless sheet of gray. James leaned against the rail of his small trawler, the Lucille, named after his late wife. She had always hated the boat, not because it kept him away, but because it reminded her of the ocean that had taken too much from their family. Still, after she passed, he never changed the name. He couldn't. The lettering along the bow was cracked and faded, but it was the only part of her he had left that still faced the sea. The nets sank heavy into the water, ropes slipping through James's scarred hands as he fed them out. His mind drifted the way it always did during this part of the job, wandering back through years of storms and sleepless nights, of comrades from his Marine days whose faces had blurred into shadows. The sea had a way of keeping the dead close. When he finally hauled the nets back up, his shoulders groaned under the weight. The ropes strained. A slick of silver fish broke the surface, thrashing in the mesh, their scales flashing dimly in the pale light. James planted his boots, bracing as the catch swung over the rail, and then he frowned. There, tangled among the fish and seaweed, was something hard and unfamiliar. It clattered onto the deck with a dull metallic thud, scattering water across the boards. James bent, pushing fish aside, and pried the object free. It was rectangular, crusted thick with barnacles, coated in a slime of seaweed and salt. For a moment he thought it was just another piece of trash, a rusted tool, maybe, or a broken part off some yacht. But as his hands scraped at the growth, his fingers traced a shape he knew well. A camera. It was heavier than it should have been, the plastic body swollen from years underwater. The lens was opaque, clouded with salt, and a tangle of sea growth curled around its buttons. James turned it over in his hands, shaking his head. Probably some tourist toy, tossed overboard on a bad day at sea. He had pulled up plenty of junk before, buoys, bottles, even an old boot once that still had the bone of a foot inside. The ocean was a collector of secrets, and now and then it spat one back. "Trash," he muttered, tossing the camera onto the deck beside the fish bin. He crouched to sort his catch, ignoring the way the strange object sat among the writhing silver. Every fisherman had his rules, and James's first was simple. Don't get attached to anything the sea gives you. You were there to take what you needed, nothing more. Curiosity was a dangerous thing on open water. Still, as he worked, his eyes drifted back to the camera. The morning dragged on. James guided the Lucille back toward the harbor, engine rumbling under his feet. The sky had brightened, but the fog refused to lift, curling around the docks as if trying to swallow the town whole. When he tied off and began unloading his catch, he noticed the camera still lying at his feet, barnacles dripping seawater onto the deck. He should have left it, tossed it back. That was the second rule every fisherman learned. If the ocean gave something once, it would take twice in return. Instead, James crouched and lifted it again. The barnacles cracked under his thumb as he scraped at the lens. He pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped at the glass, expecting nothing but salt haze. But beneath the grime, the lens gleamed clean, too clean. For a second, James thought he saw his own face staring back. But no, the angle was wrong, the reflection warped. The cheekbones were sharper, the eyes darker, the mouth set in a grim line he didn't recognize. The lens gleamed clean, and the face staring back wasn't quite his own. James blinked, rubbed at the lens again. Just his imagination, distorted by the scratches and clouding. He set the camera down, his stomach tightening in a way he couldn't explain. He didn't know it yet, but the quiet life he clung to had just ended. But small details refused to stay hidden. That evening, long after the ketch had been hauled off and the harbor had settled into its usual twilight hush, James found himself staring at the camera again. It sat on his kitchen table, a lump of black plastic and salt crust, dripping faintly into the wood. He should have tossed it. The thought kept circling his head as he stood at the sink, scrubbing his hands raw with soap that could never quite erase the smell of the sea. The rules said to throw it back, but something about it wouldn't let him. On a whim, he dug through the drawer where he kept odd cables and batteries. His wife had been the one who kept gadgets. He had no patience for them. Still, she'd left behind enough scraps of cords and chargers to power half the town. He found one that matched the camera's port, wiped the grid away, and plugged it into the wall. The camera sat there, lifeless, a dead lump. James poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat across from it. The steam curled upward, fogging his glasses. He told himself it was just an old relic, useless, worth less than the fish guts he had washed off the deck. He muttered the words out loud, just to hear them. Nothing but junk. But as the hours dragged and the light faded from the windows, a small green indicator on the side blinked. Once, twice, then steady. James's throat tightened. He set down the mug with a dull clink and leaned closer. The screen flickered, lines racing across it like veins of lightning. For a long moment there was only static, the crackling hiss filling the room with an unnatural buzz. Then, an image sharpened into focus. The first video. It showed the deck of a small boat pleasure craft, by the look of it. The footage wavered, the lens smudged with moisture. A group of tourists laughed, their voices high and unbothered, gulls screaming overhead. One of them pointed the camera toward the horizon, where the sea stretched out like steel under the afternoon Sunday. It was ordinary, harmless. James almost laughed at himself. This was what he had been afraid of? Vacation footage? But then, without warning, the image jolted. The camera shook, as if something had struck the hull. Laughter cut off in mid-breath. The horizon blurred, the waves suddenly rising, though the sky remained clear and calm. A sound leaked through the speakers, low, metallic, drawn out. Not thunder, not the groan of wood. Something deeper, like steel bending or a ship crying out from the bottom of the ocean. And then, as the sound filled the room, James felt it in his bones. His shack creaked in reply, the beams groaning as though under pressure. A draft swept through the kitchen, cold and sharp, carrying the same metallic tang he had smelled on the dock that morning. He froze. The camera screen fluttered. The tourists were shouting now, their faces blurred by water streaking the lens. The footage lurched toward the deck railing. Beyond it, the ocean twisted unnaturally, as though some unseen force had pressed upward from beneath, warping the surface into a dome. Then it cut. James sat back, breath caught in his throat. The only sound in the shack was the faint rattle of the window pane in its frame. He rubbed his arms, the hairs standing sharp against the chill. Just a glitch, he whispered, but his voice shook. He hit rewind, scrubbing the footage back. For a moment, it was normal again, laughter, gulls, ordinary sunlight. Then the shift came, sudden, violent, unavoidable. But this time, James paused it at the moment the lens shook. He leaned closer, squinting at the blurry reflection in the boat's glass window. There, a pale face. Not one of the laughing tourists, its features too stark, the skin too drained of color. Hollow eyes, dark against the sunlit background. James's chest tightened. He darted a glance over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to be standing behind him in the shack. The chair at the far end of the table sat empty, the room silent. His finger hovered over the pause button. The reflection stared back. The tourists in the foreground laughed on, unaware, but that face in the glass was frozen. Still, watching. And then the footage ended, cutting to black. James yanked the cable from the wall, the screen going dark. The kitchen plunged into silence, broken only by the ticking of the old clock his wife had hung years ago. Each tick hammered into him like a heartbeat. He sat there for what felt like an hour, staring at the lifeless camera, his breath shallow. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of light, salt damage, static bending shapes where none existed. But when he rose to pour another coffee, his eyes flicked back to the dark lens. It didn't look dead. It looked like an eye, watching him. By now, denial was no longer enough. James woke the next morning with the stale taste of brine on his tongue, as if he had spent the night drowning in seawater. The shack smelled wrong, not of coffee grounds or salt-damp wood, but of something sharper, metallic, like rust scraped against steel. He shuffled into the kitchen, eyes gritty from broken sleep, and froze when he saw the camera still sitting on the table. It hadn't moved, it hadn't turned on again, but the air around it felt heavier, charged, as though the small black box was pulling the room tighter around itself. James rubbed a hand across his face. "Enough," he muttered. He grabbed the camera, set it on the counter, and dug a paring knife into the cracks of dried barnacle still clinging to its edges. The crust split away in brittle shards scattering across the wood. When the last piece fell, he held the lens up to the light and saw scratches. Not the kind left by salt erosion or careless handling. These were jagged, sharp, like claw marks etched across the glass. He ran his thumb across them and felt the grooves bite into his skin. They weren't random, they slashed in parallel, precise, as though something had tried to scrape its way out. A shiver crawled up his arms. He set the camera down and stepped outside. The dock was shrouded in fog, thicker than usual, curling low along the planks. James had lived here his whole life. He knew fog. But this wasn't the soft veil of morning mist. It was denser, darker, a weight pressing down on the harbor. He could taste the iron in it, the same tang that had filled his shack. From above, the dock looked like it was floating on a white void. The water beneath the boards was invisible, swallowed by the haze. James knelt to check the ropes tied to the Lucille, tugging at them out of habit, though his gaze kept sliding back toward the water. He couldn't see the surface, but he swore he heard it, not the normal lap of tide against wood, but a faint sucking sound, like something shifting underneath. A cough startled him. "Morning, Holloway." James turned to see Henry Briggs, his neighbor from 2 shacks down, standing with his hands stuffed into his oil-stained jacket. Henry was a man who had spent more time gossiping than fishing these past few years, his mouth as sharp as the gulls that circled above the pier. Henry nodded toward the camera James still held. "Picked yourself up a prize, huh? Best throw that thing back." James frowned. "It's just a camera." Henry stepped closer, lowering his voice. His eyes flicked to the fog, before landing back on James. "The sea doesn't return gifts, Holloway. It spits back curses." The words hung in the damp air. For a moment neither man spoke, only the groan of a piling shifting against the tide filled the silence. Then Henry gave a short nod and walked on, vanishing into the fog as if he had never been there. James stood alone, gripping the camera until his knuckles whitened. He told himself it was just Henry being his usual dramatic self. Old Fisherman loved to spin warnings into poetry, but the way Henry had said it so flat, so certain, sat heavy in his chest. Back inside, James braced himself and turned the camera on again. Static. Then a frame blinked into view. He scrubbed through the earlier footage, slowing it down, frame by frame. The tourists blurred into water-smeared streaks. The ocean loomed too high, and then there. In one still image, frozen for a fraction of a second, a patch of dark fabric filled the corner of the screen. James leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. The letters came into focus, clear and sharp despite the damage. U.S. Navy. It was real. Not a trick of the light, not distortion. The proof was carved into the sleeve of a uniform caught just before the chaos. James's chest tightened. The memories came rushing back, his own years in uniform, the drills, the vows, the comrades who had never come home. The Navy had been his youth, his pride, and his curse. And now, here it was again, rising out of the deep like a ghost. The screen flickered. The frame vanished. Only static remained. James yanked the plug, his breath ragged. He pressed both hands flat against the table, trying to steady himself. But beneath his palms, the wood trembled just faintly, as if the shack itself had flinched. And outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows, swallowing the light. That morning, the past came back to life. James hadn't meant to open the camera again. He had sworn to himself after the patch, after Henry's warning, that he was done. But as dawn bled gray over the harbor and the fog curled low across the docks, the weight of the camera on his table was unbearable. It felt less like an object now, and more like a presence. His coffee steamed untouched beside it. His fingers twitched. At last, with a muttered curse, he reached forward and pressed play. The screen burst alive. At first, the scene looked ordinary, blurred shapes of the tourists. A boat railing, the horizon trembling. But then, the camera tilted sharply downward, plunging toward the churning waves. The sound of screaming split through the static, high-pitched, frantic. The water surged, not like a storm surge, but like something rising up beneath it. James gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. The lens dipped under the water. For a moment, only bubbles and rushing sound filled the screen. Then the image steadied, cleared, and something vast slid into view. A hull. Not wood, not fiberglass. Steel, blackened with depth, encrusted with weeds, but unmistakably intact. The footage quivered as the camera drifted closer, suspended as if drawn toward the shape. Rivets lined the surface like scars. The metal groaned in a deep, low tone that James felt in his bones. His throat went dry. The tourists' voices had vanished. Only the camera moved now, gliding along the silent, sleeping shape of the vessel. Then, with a shudder, the angle shifted, and letters stamped into the metal came into view. USS. The rest blurred, too eroded to read, but the first letters alone were enough. A United States Navy submarine. James's chest squeezed. His vision swam. Memories hit him like breakers. He was 20 again, strapped into a cramped steel coffin of a sub, listening to the creak of pressure and the whispered prayers of men who knew a hull could split at any second. He remembered the silence after a friend's final dive, the way a name could vanish into the sea with no body left behind. The image stilled. The last frame froze on the submarine lying whole in the dark as if it was only sleeping. James tore his eyes away from the screen, shoving back from the table so hard the chair legs screeched against the floor. His breath came shallow, ragged. "It's not possible," he muttered. Not possible. But the camera did not lie. He paced the shack, his boots thudding against the old floorboards. Every instinct told him to get rid of it, to toss it back into the waves and let the sea reclaim its secrets. But another part of him, the Marine, the man who had sworn to serve, whispered that this was duty, that this was truth clawing its way to the surface. His wife's photo stared at him from the shelf above the stove. Her smile was soft, her eyes kind, the way they had been before the illness hollowed her out. He remembered her voice, the way she used to beg him to quit the sea after he retired from service. "You've given enough to the ocean, James. Don't let it take more." And here he was, letting it take again. He picked up the camera, holding it at arm's length like a venomous snake. The lens was dark now, blank, but he could still see that final frame burned into his mind, the submarine, silent, whole, waiting. What was it doing there? Why hadn't it been found? A chill swept through him, sharper than the dawn air. He realized he had no answer, and worse, he wasn't sure he wanted one. From outside came the groan of wood, the dock shifting under some unseen weight. James froze, listening. The sea slapped gently against the pilings, but beneath it, faint and steady, he swore he heard the same deep metallic moan from the footage. The sound of a submarine alive in the dark. He staggered back inside and slammed the door. The coffee mug rattled on the table. The camera lay silent, but its presence filled the room, heavier than ever. James pressed his palms to the table and bowed his head. He wasn't praying he hadn't prayed since the war, but the posture was the same. He stayed there until the clock ticked past an hour, until his hands stopped trembling. Finally, he whispered to the empty room, "If I don't call for help now, it'll be too late." But when he reached for the phone, his hand hovered, frozen in the air. Would anyone even believe him? Would they believe a camera pulled from the sea, showing what should have been impossible? Or would they come for him instead? The questions gnawed at him as the fog pressed against the windows, thicker, darker, swallowing the first light of day. And somewhere in the back of his mind another thought whispered, one he couldn't silence. If the submarine was only sleeping, what would happen if it woke? But the discovery refused to stay buried. That night, James couldn't escape it. He had shut the camera inside an old tackle box, latched it tight, and shoved it beneath the kitchen table. He had poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, then 4, until the burn numbed his throat. But even then, when he closed his eyes, he saw it, the black hull, whole and waiting in the dark, as if it were not a wreck at all, but something alive, something holding its breath. The shack groaned with every shift of the tide. Normally, those sounds comforted him. They were the language of old wood, of ropes stretched taut, of water pressing at pilings. But tonight, each creak felt wrong, too heavy, too deep, like a pressure building just below the boards. James sat in his armchair, the only light a weak lamp beside him. He held his wife's photo in his hand, thumb brushing over the edge of the frame until it squeaked. "Lucille," he whispered, the name catching. "What have I brought into this house?" The silence answered. Then, a sound. Low, muffled, distant, but unmistakable. A scream. James froze, every muscle rigid. It hadn't come from outside, nor from the sea. It came from the tackle box under the table. He set the photo down with trembling fingers and leaned forward, straining to listen. The shack seemed to hold its breath. And then it came again, a muffled cry, stretched thin by water, breaking into static. "No," James muttered, shaking his head. He yanked the tackle box out, the wood scraping across the floorboards, and flipped the latch open. The camera lay inside, its dark lens blank, but a faint hum vibrated through its frame. He lifted it, his fingers trembling, and pressed play. The footage skipped. Water rushed across the screen, blurred bubbles filling the lens. Through it, James swore he heard voices desperate, panicked, calling out in words too garbled to catch. The sound clawed at him, dragging him back decades, to the memory of a night when he'd stood helpless on a deck, hearing men calling from the waves, knowing he could not save them. "Stop," he hissed, pressing the buttons with frantic fingers. The screen flickered, the cries cut off, and once more only static filled the room. But the damage was done. His hands shook as he set the camera down. He stumbled to the window, lifting the shade with one hand. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, thick as a wall. He couldn't see the dock, couldn't see the water, but he heard it, a steady groan, metallic and low, carrying across the harbor. It was the same sound the sub had made on the footage. The sound of steel straining in the dark. James let the shade fall. He backed away, breath shallow. He paced the room, then sat, then rose again, unable to settle. The photo of his wife watched from the table, her smile soft, her eyes steady. She had always been the anchor when the sea pulled too hard. Without her, he felt unmoored. Hours bled away. The clock ticked on the wall, each second a nail in his skull. Midnight passed, then 1, then 2. Sleep never came. Every time his eyes grew heavy, the metallic groans swelled again, shaking the shack, pulling him upright in terror. By 3, he was half mad with exhaustion. He sat slumped at the table, head in his hands, when a faint glow drew his gaze. The camera. He hadn't touched it, hadn't powered it, but the screen glowed faintly, a sickly green, then shifted. A single red light flickered on in the lens, sharp and unnatural in the dark. James's breath caught. The glow pulsed slowly. Once, twice, again. Like a heartbeat. The shadows seemed to bend around it, the air itself humming with each pulse. James stared, paralyzed, his mind torn between smashing it to pieces or bolting from the shack. But his body betrayed him. He could only watch as the red glow brightened, casting streaks across the table. And then, just as suddenly it winked out, darkness swallowed the room again. James exhaled, ragged and broken. He pressed both palms to his face, forcing himself to breathe. He told himself it had to be a battery surge, a fault in the circuits, nothing more. But deep down, he knew better. He knew the ocean had given him this for a reason, and he knew the night would not be the last time it called to him. By morning, he was no longer the only one who noticed. James stepped out onto the dock with hollow eyes, his clothes wrinkled, his breath fogging in the chill. He hadn't slept, couldn't. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he saw that red glow pulsing in the dark like a heartbeat. Now, as the tide lapped against the pilings, the fog seemed even thicker, curling low and clinging to the wood, as though it refused to lift. But it wasn't just the fog. Something else hung in the air, a tension, a current that seemed to ripple through the town itself. He felt it in the way the gulls circled lower, in the way the dogs barked restless in their yards, in the way the fishermen who passed him offered looks that lingered too long. "Morning, Holloway," a voice called. James turned to see two younger men hauling nets onto their skiff. They paused, their eyes darting to the camera case under James's arm. One of them spat into the water. "Word is, you pulled something strange up in your nets." James stiffened. "Word travels fast." "Too fast," the other muttered. He lowered his voice, but it carried across the still air. "You should have thrown it back. Some things the ocean keeps for a reason." James's jaw tightened. He didn't answer, just turned and walked further down the dock, the wood groaning under his boots. But everywhere he went, whispers followed. By noon, a cluster of fishermen had gathered near the bait shack. James caught fragments as he passed. A cursed lens. It sees what shouldn't be seen. No wreck sinks like that unless it's meant to. Old men hunched against the fog, shaking their heads, as younger voices traded rumors sharp as knives. Some claimed James had pulled up treasure, others that he'd hauled in evidence of a crime long buried. And then there were the darker voices, the ones that spoke of omens and curses, of the ocean punishing those who pried too deep. James stopped at the edge of the crowd. "You all got nothing better to do?" he asked, his voice rough. The group fell silent for a moment. Then an older fisherman, his beard stained with tobacco, lifted his gaze. "Some wrecks rot, Holloway," he said softly. "That one waits." The words cut deeper than any accusation. James opened his mouth, but another voice interrupted low, gravelly, from the back of the crowd. "Storms don't sink steel like that." James turned. It was the veteran, a gaunt man named Roy Whalen, who had lived in Cedar Point as long as James could remember. Roy rarely spoke. He spent most of his days sitting alone on the pier, staring at the water with eyes that never seemed to leave the past. Now those eyes were fixed on James. For a moment, silence wrapped around them both. Then Roy turned away, as if he'd already said too much. The crowd shifted, uneasy. Some muttered, some spat into the sea, but none pressed closer. James felt their stares burning his back as he walked away. By afternoon, even the children had caught the fever. A group of them dared each other to run up to James's shack and tap on the door, whispering about the cursed camera. He heard their giggles through the thin walls, the quick patter of footsteps retreating down the dock. But when he looked outside, the laughter cut off. The kids were staring wide-eyed at the shack, their faces pale. James followed their gaze. In the dirt just beyond his steps, footprints trailed up toward his door, not child-sized, bare, wide, heavy. He frowned. They hadn't been there that morning. He crouched, touching the damp outline. The mud was wet, as though the prints had been left only minutes ago. He followed them with his eyes, his stomach tightening. They stopped at his door, but they never led away. James's breath caught. He straightened slowly, scanning the fog-drenched dock. The harbor lay still, empty. Only the gulls wheeled above, crying out in thin, jagged voices. Behind him, the children bolted, their screams fading into the town. James stood frozen, staring at the footprints that ended at his threshold. He wasn't alone anymore. Whispers soon turned into shouts. By the next morning, the dock was no longer just a place of work. It had become a gathering ground, a stage for suspicion and fear. The fog hadn't lifted for 2 days, and the air was damp and close, carrying voices farther than usual. Every word spoken seemed to hang there, heavy and impossible to ignore. James carried a coil of rope over his shoulder, trying to keep to himself. But the crowd thickened near the bait shack. Fishermen leaned against crates, their hands idle, eyes fixed on him as if he carried the plague. Women who usually came to fetch fish for their families stayed back, whispering behind their scarves. Even the dogs growled low, pacing the planks. One man finally spoke up. "You keeping it, Holloway?" His voice was sharp, accusing. "That thing you pulled up? You still got it?" James froze. The rope dug into his shoulder, heavier than it should have been. "It's just a camera," he said, forcing his voice steady. "Just a camera," the man spat. "Then why's the tide gone sour since you brought it in? Why's the fog so thick you can't see your own hands?" Murmurs rose around him. Someone muttered about nets coming back empty. Another swore the fish they hauled were covered in strange sores. A woman claimed her boy had woken screaming, saying he'd seen a red light glowing beneath the waves. "That's enough," James snapped. His voice cut through the noise, but his heart thudded in his chest. But it wasn't enough. The crowd pressed closer, anger simmering in their eyes. Two younger men stepped forward, faces flushed. One shoved a finger toward James's chest. "You think you're bigger than the sea? You think you can keep what it spat back? You'll bring ruin on us all." James's fists clenched. He could feel the old heat rising, the soldier in him itching to push back. But before he could move, another voice cut through. "Leave it." An older fisherman growled. His hands trembled around his pipe, but his voice was steady. "The ocean marks its debt. You stir it, you drown." The words carried like a verdict. The younger men muttered but stepped back, though their eyes stayed fixed on James with a venom that promised this wasn't over. James turned, ready to leave, when a sound broke the tension, a sharp crack, like wood splintering. Every head whipped toward the harbor. Through the fog, one of the smaller skiffs listed hard to one side. The men aboard shouted, scrambling as water surged up from beneath, rocking the boat with unnatural force. For a moment, James thought it would tip entirely. Then, as quickly as it came, the surge subsided. The skiff settled, the men cursing as they scrambled to bail water. The crowd erupted. Some cried out that it was an omen, others that James had cursed the harbor. The air buzzed with panic, the fog swallowing every word until it all bled into one frantic hum. James's pulse hammered. He turned away from the scene, his boots striking hard against the planks as he made for his shack. The crowd's voices followed him like a swarm. At the edge of the dock, he stopped, because someone was standing there. Roy Whalen, the veteran, the man who had spoken so little the day before. He was half shadow in the fog, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on James. For a long moment, Roy said nothing. Then, in a voice low but cutting, he spoke. "You know it wasn't the storm that put that steel down there." James's breath caught. He wanted to ask what Roy meant, but the older man had already turned, melting back into the fog like a ghost. James stood rooted, shaken by the words. Behind him the crowd grew louder, the whispers now sharpened into curses, warnings, threats. He forced himself to keep walking. By the time he reached his shack, his hands were trembling. He dropped the coil of rope onto the steps and glanced down. The footprints were still there. The same bare, heavy marks pressed into the dirt, leading up to his door, damp as though they were fresh. But again no trail leading away. James swallowed hard, fumbling with the latch. He shoved the door open and slipped inside, bolting it behind him. The shack was silent, save for the steady creak of the beams. But James couldn't shake the feeling that the silence was holding something back, like the hush before a storm. Outside, the voices rose and fell. The town was fracturing, fear spreading like rot. And James knew, with a weight that pressed cold into his bones, that whatever secret the sea had returned to him was no longer just his burden. It belonged to the whole town now. Now the law stood at his dock. The morning fog had barely thinned when the crunch of tires rolled across the gravel road above the harbor. James looked up from coiling rope to see a sheriff's cruiser pull in, headlights dim against the pale mist. The engine cut, and Sheriff Alan Greaves stepped out, his boots heavy on the damp boards. Two deputies followed, their jackets dark with dew, eyes scanning the dock like they expected trouble. James felt the weight of every stare from the fishermen nearby. They paused mid-task, leaning against their boats and crates, watching, whispering. He could feel their relief that the burden had shifted now the law was here. The responsibility would no longer be theirs. "Morning, Holloway," Greaves said, his voice low but firm. He had the kind of face that looked carved from stone, steady but unreadable. Still, James noticed something in his eyes, not suspicion, not yet, but something close to unease. "Morning," James answered, his throat dry. "You pulled something up out there." The sheriff's tone was flat, not a question. James hesitated. His hand brushed the camera case at his side. "A camera. Old. Found it tangled in the nets." Greaves gave a short nod. "Folks say it shows things." "That's just dock gossip," James muttered. The sheriff's gaze held him for a beat too long. Then he turned to his deputies. "Set it up." They moved quickly, unloading a scanner from the cruiser, a bulky sonar unit usually used for search and rescue along the coast. The hum of the machine filled the fog-damp air as they rolled cables toward the pier. James's stomach twisted. "You don't need to do this," he said, more sharply than he intended. Greaves didn't answer. He just walked to the edge of the dock, his broad shoulders tense beneath his jacket, and stared out at the mist that swallowed the horizon. Behind James, the crowd of fishermen grew. Some leaned close, whispering in excitement. Others muttered warnings. A woman crossed herself. A man spat into the sea. The air buzzed like a hive ready to burst. James clutched the camera case tighter. He felt exposed, pinned beneath their eyes, and the silent weight of the sheriff's presence. One of the deputies approached him. "Sheriff wants to see it." James's heart lurched. "It's nothing but wreck footage," he said. "Water damage. Static. Then there's no harm showing it." The words cut like a blade. James's grip on the case tightened, his knuckles white. He thought of his wife's photo on the shelf, of Roy Whelan's voice the day before. Storms don't sink steel like that. He wanted to bury the thing in the deepest part of the sea, let the truth rot with the bones it carried. But he knew the choice was gone. Slowly, he set the case on the table near the bait shack and opened it. The crowd pressed closer. The sheriff stepped forward. James plugged the camera into a portable screen the deputies had brought, his hands trembling. The footage flickered to life. Tourists laughing. Horizon steady. The sudden tilt, the screams. The water rushing over the lens. Then the steel. Black, silent, whole. The hull of the submarine looming in the dark. The murmurs grew frantic. Someone cursed. Someone else whispered a prayer. Sheriff Greaves leaned in, his eyes narrowing. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. James watched him carefully. The sheriff's face didn't change, but his hands gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. When the last frame froze, the submarine lying whole in the dark, the sheriff reached forward and cut the feed. The screen went black. Silence fell across the dock. Greaves straightened slowly. "We'll need to take a closer look," he said. His voice was even, but James caught the tension in it. He turned to his deputies. "Get the sonar running." The machine throbbed to life, sending pulses into the deep. The crowd leaned forward as the display lit, grainy outlines forming on the screen. At first, only the seafloor appeared, ridges and troughs, the scars of currents. Then, slowly, a shape emerged. Long, straight, too precise to be natural. A hull. The display crackled, the outline fuzzing, then sharpening again. The crowd gasped. James's chest tightened. It was there. The same vessel, the same ghost from the footage. Greaves's face remained unreadable, but his lips pressed thin. He barked orders to his deputies, who began marking coordinates, their voices low and urgent. James stepped closer. "What are you going to do?" The sheriff didn't look at him. "Divers at dawn. We'll see what's down there." "You don't understand," James began, but Greaves cut him off with a hard glance. "Go home, Holloway. This isn't yours anymore." The words hit like a blow. James felt the eyes of the town turn from suspicion to something worse relief. The burden had shifted. Whatever came next, it was no longer on his shoulders. But as he walked back toward his shack, the fog closing around him, James knew the truth. It was still his, because he had brought it up, and because when the divers went down tomorrow, they wouldn't be able to put it back. What the divers saw made their faces turn pale. The next dawn broke cold and gray, the harbor smothered in fog so thick it seemed carved from stone. The town gathered along the docks in silence, their breaths clouding in the air, their boots thudding softly on damp planks. James stood apart from them, his shoulders hunched, the camera case clutched like an anchor he could not let go. Sheriff Greaves arrived first, jaw tight, his eyes ringed with sleepless shadows. Behind him came the deputies, dragging coils of rope, crates of gear, and a portable monitor. But it was the divers who drew the crowd closer, men in black wetsuits, helmets gleaming, their tanks hissing softly as they checked their regulators. They moved with the calm precision of men who had done this before, but James could see it in their faces, the unease they tried to bury beneath discipline. "Coordinates marked?" Greaves asked. "Marked and confirmed," a deputy replied. The divers nodded once, then stepped onto the skiff that would carry them out. Engines coughed to life, the sound muffled by the fog, and the vessel glided into the gray until it vanished. Only the faint ripple of water remained. The crowd waited. Children whispered, shushed quickly by their parents. The gulls wheeled but did not cry, as though the sky itself held its breath. James's pulse hammered in his ears. He wanted to turn away, to walk back to his shack and bar the door, but he couldn't. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen the deputies set up, wired to the divers' cameras. Static. Then darkness. The feed flickered, showing water rushing past the lens. Bubbles trailed upward, light dimming with every meter. The diver's breathing filled the speakers, steady but harsh. Then, slowly, the outline of the seafloor appeared, rippling sand, scattered rock, currents stirring silt into clouds. The camera tilted. There it was. The submarine loomed out of the dark like a shadow made of steel. Its hull was intact, rivets lined like scars, its form half buried in silt. Seaweed draped along its sides like the shrouds of the dead. A collective gasp rolled through the crowd. Someone crossed themselves. Someone else whispered, "God help us." James's breath caught. Seeing it on video had been one thing. Seeing it live, undeniable, was another. The divers swam closer, their lights sweeping across the hull. The beams revealed details, long buried scratches, dents, symbols carved faintly into the steel. The letters still visible, USS. The rest lost to corrosion. Then the camera dipped toward a jagged hole torn into the side. The light cut through the blackness inside. A shape drifted into view. At first, James thought it was debris fabric maybe, or a piece of wreckage suspended in the water. But then the light steadied, and the truth hit like ice. A body. Preserved by the cold and pressure, the uniform still clung to it, the face pale and waxen beneath a cracked visor. The insignia gleamed faintly under the diver's torch, the stars of a long-forgotten officer's rank. Gasps broke into shouts on the dock. Children clung to their mothers, men cursed. James gripped the railing, his breath ragged. He remembered faces like that, comrades lost at sea, pulled back days later, their eyes empty, their mouths forever frozen mid-breath. The diver's camera steadied on the corpse. A hand reached out, hesitant, brushing the sleeve. The insignia caught the light again, clearer this time. Not just a mark of service, a mark of secrecy. James knew it the instant he saw it. This wasn't just a submarine. It wasn't just a wreck. It was something buried, hidden. This grave was meant to stay sealed, one of the investigators whispered beside the monitor. His voice was low, strained, as though admitting it aloud was dangerous. The words rippled through the crowd. Fear flared, whispers rising sharp and frantic. Some backed away, shaking their heads. Others pressed closer, drawn like moths to the flame of horror. James's stomach twisted. The old guilt surged up. Memories of men left behind, missions that demanded silence. His hands trembled on the railing. On the screen, the divers moved deeper into the wreck. The camera flickered, static bleeding across the feed. More shapes drifted into view, not just one body, but many. Dozens. Some still strapped into their seats, helmets tilted, fingers curled around rusted controls. Silent men, locked forever in their steel coffin beneath the waves. The crowd erupted, shouts, prayers, curses. The dock quaked under the stamp of boots as people surged against one another. James staggered back, pressing against the wall of the bait shack, his eyes glued to the screen. The diver's feed fuzzed, the image breaking. A deep groan filled the speakers, metal straining, shifting, as if the hull itself resented being disturbed. The sound rumbled through the dock, vibrating in James's chest until he felt his ribs might crack. Then the feed cut to black. The crowd shouted louder, panic spilling like water breaking a dam. Deputies barked orders, trying to push them back. Sheriff Greaves stood stone still, his face pale but unreadable. He raised a hand, silencing his men. "We saw enough," he said quietly, but James heard what he didn't say. "We weren't supposed to see any of it." The sheriff's eyes flicked to him then, just for a moment. Something passed between them, not anger, not blame, but a weary knowledge. And it made James's stomach sink. Because if the law had known about this wreck before, they had chosen silence. And if they hadn't, someone above them surely had. The fog pressed closer around the dock, swallowing the horizon, and James Holloway knew the sea hadn't given him back a relic. It had given him a warning. By nightfall, the whole town was talking. The diver's feed had cut hours ago, but the images still burned in every mind. Steel hull in the dark, pale faces behind glass, uniforms that belonged to ghosts. Fear spread through Cedar Point like oil on water, slick and unstoppable. The harbor, usually a place of laughter and cursing and engines coughing to life, was now a stage for panic. News of the wreck had spilled beyond the docks. By afternoon, vans with satellite dishes lined the gravel road, their headlights slicing the fog. Reporters pressed microphones into locals' faces, their voices eager, their questions sharp. What did you see? Is it true the Navy covered it up? Did the fisherman who found it know more than he's saying? James tried to slip past them, pulling his coat tight, but the moment they saw him, the tide of questions surged. Mr. Holloway, did you find the wreck on purpose? Do you believe it's haunted? Are you working with the Navy? He shoved through them, jaw clenched, his heart hammering. He wanted to shout, to tell them all it was nothing but a cursed mistake, that he had only been fishing. But the words stuck in his throat. Anything he said would only fuel the fire. At the dock, locals had gathered in tight clusters. Some argued fiercely, waving their arms, their voices cracking with fear. Others sat in silence, their eyes vacant, as if waiting for the sea itself to speak. Children huddled together, wide-eyed, repeating phrases they didn't understand. The cursed lens, the waiting wreck. James's shack, once ignored, had become a beacon. People lingered near it, staring at the door as though the camera inside might burst through at any moment. Teenagers dared each other to creep closer, their nervous laughter echoing across the planks. Every time James opened his door, conversation stilled. Inside, the camera sat on his table, silent, still, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware, listening to the chaos it had created. By evening, the arguments turned to shouting. Near the bait shack, two fishermen squared off, their fists clenched. We bring the Navy in now, clean it up before it rots the whole town, one barked. And what if they bury it deeper? The other snapped. You think they'll tell us the truth? They'll lock it down and we'll never know what's under our feet. They should have left it there in the first place, another voice cried. Holloway cursed us, pulling it up. The crowd roared, fear boiling into anger. Someone shoved, a crate toppled, a bottle shattered on the boards. For a heartbeat, James thought the whole town might tear itself apart right there on the dock. Then came the sound. A low groan rolled across the harbor, long and deep, like the shifting of some giant weight beneath the waves. The crowd froze. Every head turned toward the black water. Even the reporters fell silent. James's blood ran cold. It was the same sound he had heard in his shack, the sound from the footage, the submarine's cry. The dock trembled underfoot. The water slapped hard against the pilings, then stilled, too suddenly, like a breath held beneath the surface. For a long moment, no one moved. Then panic erupted. Families scrambled toward their trucks. Reporters shouted into cameras, their words drowned by the stamp of boots. Fishermen cursed, hauling nets and gear away from the water as though they could pack up their lives in a single night. James stood in the middle of it, the world blurring around him. His hands shook. His chest felt hollow. He could hear Lucille's voice in his memory. The sea's taken enough from you, James. Don't let it take more. He wanted to throw the camera back, to run to the dock, hurl it into the black, and watch it sink until the sea swallowed it whole. He pictured it in his hands, arm cocked, ready to cast it into the dark. But when he lifted it, his grip faltered, because it felt heavy, too heavy for its size, as if it carried more than plastic and glass. And worse, the lens glinted faintly in the dim light. A reflection. Watching him. His arm trembled. He couldn't move. And in that frozen moment, James knew it wasn't him holding the camera. It was the camera holding him. Then came the men who spoke in whispers. By dawn the next morning, Cedar Point no longer belonged to itself. The gravel road was lined with black sedans, their windows dark, their engines idling like hounds waiting for command. Men in suits stepped out, crisp shoes striking damp boards, their collars turned high against the fog. They carried no badges, no names, only clipped voices and steel cases. The townsfolk shrank back, their chaos from the night before collapsing into wary silence. The reporters, hungry for answers, rushed forward with microphones and cameras, but within minutes, the men had pushed them aside, their gear confiscated, their shouts smothered under the cold efficiency of authority. James watched from his shack window, heart pounding. He had seen men like this before, not in town but overseas, during his service. Men who arrived when something needed to disappear. A knock rattled his door. 3 short taps. James opened it to find 2 of them standing there. Their suits were immaculate despite the mist, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Holloway," one said, his tone flat, "we need the device." James's throat tightened. "It's not yours to take." The man's eyes flicked once toward the table, where the camera sat in its case. "It was never yours to find." James's gut twisted. Still, he stepped aside slowly, letting them pass. They moved like shadows, silent but absolute. One opened the case and lifted the camera. The lens, dark as stone, seemed to pulse faintly in the morning light. "Wait," James said, his voice cracking. "What's down there? Why hasn't it ever been brought up?" Neither man answered. They closed the case and turned for the door. "Tell me," James shouted, his fists trembling at his sides. The second man paused. He didn't look back, but his voice was low, precise, like a knife drawn in the dark. "You didn't find it," he said. "It found you." Then they were gone, the door shutting softly behind them. James sagged into his chair, his breath shaking. The shack felt empty now, hollow, as though the air itself had been stripped away with the camera. Yet the silence was worse than its presence had been. His hands ached to clutch it again, to prove it had all been real, that he hadn't imagined the faces, the hull, the screams. He glanced at the shelf. Lucille's photo stared back at him, her smile steady, her eyes kind. He remembered her warning voice in his head. "The sea takes, James. Don't let it take you too." But it already had. Through the thin glass, James saw the suits loading equipment onto unmarked trucks. Locals stood in clusters, whispering, too afraid to speak aloud. Even Sheriff Greaves was there, his arms folded, his jaw set. His eyes met James's for a brief moment, and in them, James saw guilt, heavy, quiet guilt. The trucks rumbled to life. The camera was gone. Yet the weight inside James did not lift. That night, the phone rang. James stared at it, his hand hovering above the receiver. It hadn't rung in months. He lived alone, and the few who still called used their cell phones. This was the old landline, the one Lucille used to answer with a warm, practiced hello. The ring droned, sharp and shrill against the silence. Finally, with a trembling hand, James picked it up. Static hissed on the other end, then a voice low, strained, almost a whisper. "You're not the first to see it, Holloway." "Not—" James's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" The voice cut sharper. The others disappeared. "So will you, if you keep asking questions." The line went dead. James stood there, the receiver pressed to his ear, the silence screaming louder than any threat. His hand shook as he lowered it back into the cradle. Outside, the fog pressed heavy against the windows. The air smelled faintly of iron again, sharp and metallic. He sat at the table, staring at the empty space where the camera had been, his mind spinning. The suits had taken it, but he knew it hadn't left him. Because in the stillness of the shack, he swore he could hear it, a faint hum, low and steady, like a heartbeat pulsing through the floorboards. And when he looked at Lucille's photo, her reflection in the glass seemed darker than he remembered, like another face was staring back. Every shadow now felt like a watcher. James walked through Cedar Point the next morning with his collar turned up, eyes scanning every corner. He hadn't slept, he hadn't eaten. The threatening phone call still echoed in his ears. The others disappeared. So will you. And yet, what frightened him most was not the voice, but the silence afterward. The silence that clung to him now, dogging his steps through every alley, every street. He passed the bait shack, where clusters of fishermen hunched together, their voices low. Conversations cut short when he approached. Eyes slid away, yet James felt them on his back long after he passed. At the post office, his hands shook as he fumbled with his key. When he opened the box, the metal door swung too freely someone had pried it open. Inside lay only one thing, a strip of wet film. No envelope, no explanation. He pulled it out with trembling fingers, holding it up to the light. The frame was blurred, water-streaked, but there, faintly, he saw it. The silhouette of the submarine, deeper than the last footage had shown. And behind it, darker still, another shadow. Larger, waiting. James shoved the film back inside and slammed the box shut. His chest heaved, breath rattling in the quiet post office. He staggered outside into the gray daylight. His stomach knotted with dread. By afternoon, he was certain he was being followed. Footsteps trailed him down the dock, steady, heavy, always a half beat behind his own. When he stopped, they stopped. When he turned, no one was there. The fog thickened, swallowing every trace, leaving only the echo of pursuit. Back at his shack, he locked the door, bolted the windows, and sat at the table with Lucille's photo in his hands. The glass reflected his face, pale and drawn, but as he turned it, he swore for a heartbeat he saw another reflection, layered over his own hollow eyes, pale-skinned, the face he had glimpsed in the camera's footage. His grip tightened. "I won't let it take me," he whispered. His voice cracked, but saying the words out loud gave them a thin edge of strength. Night came heavy. Waves crashed harder than usual, slamming the pilings with bone-rattling force. The air stank of salt and iron, thick enough to taste. James sat rigid in the dark, every creak of the shack making his nerves jolt. The hum he thought he had escaped now seemed to pulse through the walls, steady, insistent, like a heartbeat synced to his own. A knock broke the silence. James froze. It wasn't the quick rap of a neighbor, nor the official pound of a deputy. It was soft. 3 slow taps, deliberate. He rose, muscles tight, and moved to the door. His hand hovered over the knob. "Who's there?" he called, his voice thin. No answer. Only the fog pressing against the walls, the crash of the tide. He yanked the door open. Roy Whelan stood there. The veteran's face was carved with shadows, his eyes hollow as the wreck James had seen on the screen. He looked thinner than ever, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Roy's voice broke the silence. "That wreck wasn't a storm, Holloway." His words rasped, each one dragged out of him like it cost him blood. It was orders. James's heart lurched. He gripped the doorframe to steady himself. "What are you saying?" Roy's gaze dropped, his jaw tightening. "We sank her. Not the sea. Not a storm. Us." The words hit like a blow. James staggered back, his chest hollowing. His mind reeled the bodies, the insignia, the silent hull waiting below. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was deliberate. Roy looked up, his eyes wet with guilt. "They told us to keep quiet, said it was necessary, said no one would ever know." He shook his head, his voice breaking. "But the ocean remembers. And now, so do you." James's hands trembled. The weight of it pressed down on him, heavier than the sea itself. His stomach twisted, his pulse a thunder in his ears. For years, he had lived with guilt for the men he couldn't save. Now he knew the truth was darker, the wreck had been buried on purpose. And in that moment, James realized with a cold shiver, the wreck carried something far worse than men. And then the last secret broke free. James couldn't stop shaking after Roy's confession. The words clung to him like the salt in the air. "We sank her." It was orders. He had carried guilt all his life for what the sea had taken. Now he knew the truth. It wasn't the sea. It was men. Men like him. Men who had sworn oaths. By morning the fog had thickened again, so dense the dock disappeared after a few steps. James stood outside his shack, the boards damp under his boots, when a figure emerged, Sheriff Greaves. His broad shoulders filled the mist as he walked closer, his eyes dark hollows. The townsfolk lingered at the edge of sight, shadows in the haze, too afraid to follow. "Need to talk, Holloway," the sheriff said, his voice flat. James's gut twisted. "About what? The wreck? The men down there?" Greaves's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You weren't supposed to see it. None of us were." James stared. "You knew." The sheriff's eyes flicked to the ground. His silence was answer enough. James's fists clenched. "How long?" Greaves's gaze lifted, hard now, defiant. "Since the day they sank her. I was a young deputy then. They came, they paid, they swore us to silence. Said it was for the country, said the ocean would keep the rest." James's breath came sharp. His chest felt hollow. "So you let it rot out there. Let the truth rot with it." Greaves stepped closer still, his voice a whisper edged with steel. "We swore the same oath, Holloway. Mine was silence. Yours should have been too." His face hardened, eyes burning. "And now you've broken both of us." The words hit like a fist. James staggered back, his throat tight. He saw his younger self reflected in Greaves, both of them men who had served, men who had obeyed. Only now, James felt the weight of what obedience had cost. The sheriff's eyes glistened with something between rage and despair. "They'll come for you. They'll come for me. We can't stop it." Before James could answer, a shout rose from the fog. One of the deputies stumbled forward, his face pale, his breath ragged. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Greaves and James followed him down the dock, boots striking wet wood. The fog parted just enough to reveal the monitor the agents had left behind. Static fuzzed across the screen, but then an image sharpened. Not the first wreck. Deeper. The sonar scan tilted, cutting through the dark. A second shape loomed on the screen, larger, broader, more jagged. Not a submarine. Something else. Another vessel. Buried deeper in the abyss, its outline warped, its shadow vast. The deputies muttered in confusion. One crossed himself, whispering under his breath. James's stomach dropped. His hands gripped the railing until his knuckles whitened. The air smelled sharper now, thick with that metallic tang, as though the sea itself bled iron. On the monitor, the image held steady. The camera tilted just enough for the lens to catch it again, the shadow of the second wreck. Waiting, the hairs rose on James's neck. He heard Roy's voice in his mind. It wasn't the storm. It was orders. Orders. And maybe not just one. His chest tightened with dread. The sheriff muttered, his voice cracked. "God help us." They didn't just sink one. And then the sonar glitched, the image stuttering. For a heartbeat, the shadow seemed to move, tilting, shifting, like something alive in the deep. James's pulse hammered. The fog pressed closer around them, the sea groaning low beneath the dock. The monitor flickered once more. And then, clear as day, the lens tilted, catching a second shadow deeper in the abyss. But some secrets never truly stay buried. In the days that followed, Cedar Point slipped into a silence thicker than the fog that never seemed to lift. The news vans were gone, driven off or silenced. No one knew. The black sedans had vanished too, their engines growling into the night until only tire tracks remained on the gravel road. What was left was a town fractured, a place where no one looked one another in the eye for too long, where conversations cut short the moment boots echoed on the dock. James Holloway no longer fished. For the first time in 4 decades, the Lucille sat tied to the pier, her hull rocking aimlessly in the tide, net stiff with salt, ropes slack. James could not bring himself to untie her. Each time he walked down the dock, the water beneath groaned, the fog curled tighter, and the memory of that sonar image, 2 shadows stacked in the abyss, filled his chest like a weight he could not breathe past. At night, the sea no longer sang him to sleep. It stalked him. The groans of metal carried across the harbor, low and steady, vibrating in his walls until the glass rattled. Sometimes, when the wind stilled, he swore he could hear it, a faint pulse, a heartbeat echoing from beneath the waves. And always, the whispers of the townsfolk reached him. Holloway cursed us. He brought it up. He should have left it down there. Others will come, you'll see. He kept his head low, his eyes forward, but each word pierced deep. One evening, after another sleepless night, James stood at the edge of the dock with a bundle in his arms. The salt wind whipped cold against his face as he set the bundle down his nets, coiled tight. They had carried him through his whole life, fed him, broken his back, stained his hands. Now, they felt like chains. He doused them in kerosene. A single match struck bright in the fog, the flame small and defiant. He touched it to the netting. The fire caught with a soft roar, sparks leaping upward, the heat pushing back the cold for a fleeting moment. James stepped back, watching as years of his life burned. The flames climbed higher, crackling, licking the salt-wet air. Reflections danced across the harbor water, broken and twisted. For the first time in years, James whispered aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Lucille, it's done." From his coat, he pulled her photograph, the one that had sat on the kitchen shelf since the day she'd died. Her smile shone through the soot on the glass, her eyes soft and steady. He held it against his chest for a long moment, then kissed it gently. He stepped to the edge of the dock and let it fall. The frame hit the water with barely a splash, then sank, slipping beneath the black surface. The ripples spread outward, swallowed by the fog. James turned and walked away. He didn't look back at the burning nets. He didn't look back at the harbor. For the first time in 40 years, he walked away from the sea, and this time he did not return. But Cedar Point did not forget. The town whispered long after James locked his shack and left the coast. Some said he had gone inland, far from salt and tide. Others swore they saw him wandering the pier at night, a ghost among ghosts. The sheriff rarely spoke any more, his eyes hollow, his words clipped. And Roy Whalen never came to the dock again, as if confessing the truth had stolen what little was left of him. Still, the harbor remained. The fog never fully lifted. Fishermen swore their nets snagged on things too deep, too heavy to be rock. Engines stalled near the coordinates. Lights flickered under the water where no boat should be. And then there was the rumor that spread fastest, whispered in taverns and bait shops, never allowed on the docks. That on fog-heavy nights. A faint glow shimmered below the surface. Red, steady, like a camera light, as if the same lens that once stared back at James Holloway still waits in the deep, watching for the next hand to lift it.